Good afternoon. Thank you for coming and for this wonderful afternoon that we're going to hear the insights from our three panelists. Now, they all have something to do with transition. Some built a career on transition, and some lost their career on transition temporarily. I would like to invite Professor Wu Bing-tai. Professor Wu is Professor of Economics at University of California at Davis campus. He has been, of course, the Executive Director of Penang Institute. As you all know, that Penang Institute is now launching Penang Paradigm, a policy document proposing the directions of how the Penang state should move on in the next 10 years. But other than, prior to advising Penang state government in his capacity at Penang Institute, Professor Wu was actually advisor to the Polish government after the transition. And he has offered his professional advices to countries from different backgrounds, from China to Iran. So there's a lot of things that we're going to learn from Professor Wu. Next, we'd like to invite Professor Anwar Nasution. Professor Anwar Nasution is from Universitas Indonesia. He was, from 1999 to 2004, the Senior Deputy of the Central Bank of Indonesia, immediately after the period of transition. And from 2004 to today, he's heading the National Audit Agency. So one of the top economists from Indonesia. Next, I would like to invite Saudara Azrul Aswar. He's certainly very famous. You see, when we talk about academic freedom, normally we will have in mind that academics getting persecuted for speaking the truth and so on. Saudara Azrul make an exception to this. He practically lost his job as chief economist at Bank Islam for speaking in a forum in Singapore. And why? His sin was that he predicted that out of the three scenario analysis, two of them would see a victory of Pakatan Rakyat. And so now, today, just now, we have heard from Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim. At one point, one of the best finance minister in Asia, and many people who see now as the next prime minister in waiting, narrating that the directions of what Pakatan Rakyat would go. However, I mean, as much as we talk about all this, there was always some fear, some sense of anxieties, especially in the business community. Well, granted, it's not easy to think about change when that has never taken place before. You know, we used to have an old joke saying that in UK, you basically keep your queen all the time. For every 5 years, you have a chance to change your prime minister. In this country, we basically change our king every 5 years, but you keep the prime minister, you know, to perhaps as long as 23 years. So it's a different country, and it's normal. I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to be worried about, you know, the uncertainty following before, during, and after transition, should that happen. But it's important for us to be rational about this. It is a situation as simple as, like, if you worry about, you know, how clean is your hand, you can go to wash your hand. Now, that's perfectly rational and normal. But if you do that, you know, 10 times between 1 minute, you would be considered of suffering compulsive obsessive disorder. And I think that's what we are looking at today. We all are dealing about risk, on how things to move on and so on. It's a question then, you know, how realistic, how pragmatic our worry and concerns is all about, and that's why we are here. And without further ado, I would like to invite our speakers to begin. And every one of them would be given about 20 minutes. But of course, that we may be giving them a bit of time in case that's necessary. I would first invite Professor Wu Wing-Tai. Is it ready?
Good afternoon. Respected members of Parliament, long-time friends, and esteemed guests of the three sponsoring institutes, and my fellow residents of Malaysia. I'm very happy that I have the chance to report to you a part of the work program that we have been carrying out at the Penang Institute. Today, I would like to suggest that we can draw three broad operational principles from the experiences around the world of what happened when political transition occurs. In the last 2 months, especially, there have been two constant themes in the news media. One is the economy has taken a turn for the better. Specifically, the GDP growth rate of the last quarter is 6.4%, up from 5.2% in the earlier quarter, and certainly higher than the 10-year average of around 5%. So things are moving in the right direction, and in fact, this prompted Nur Yaakob to say that Malaysia would achieve developed country status before 2020. So the first theme of the news media has been, things are looking up, we are turned the corner, and good times is just round the other corner. The second constant theme in the news media is the focus on the opinions of some experts of what would happen to the economy if a change in government were to occur. In my opinion, the most important requirement in answering the question of what would be the economic response be to economic transition, the most important requirement is to have the right analogy in mind. Specifically, the right analogy to have in mind is that of a slightly depressed patient who shows up at the clinic and he complains about general fatigue. Now let me talk about two outcomes, and can we conclude whether the clinic's doctor is competent or not competent. In the first outcome, the patient leaves the clinic laughing, clapping, dancing. So outcome one is he walks in depressed and he leaves in higher spirits. The second outcome is the patient is put under sedation, put on stretcher, taken to the hospital, and then turned into the ICU for another week before being discharged. So the second outcome is the man walks into the clinic and is carried out of the clinic. So question, is the clinic's doctor competent under outcome one and incompetence under outcome two? I see boredom in the audience, largely because this is a silly question, because I haven't given you enough information about how to read it. At the minimum, you naturally want to know what's the long run outcome for each of these scenarios. In other words, we know what happened immediately, but what happened, let's say, a few years down the road from this visit? More importantly, you want to know what was causing this general fatigue in the first place. Only if we identify what the cause is, then we can know whether the doctor was any good in identifying the illness and prescribing the right medicine. If I tell you that the long run consequence of outcome one is that the patient died after 2 hours because he came in, and since he was feeling tired and a little depressed, the doctor gave him a huge dosage of adrenaline and LSD. So he went out happy, and that excitement accelerated his heart attack, and he was dead in 2 hours. The second one is that the doctor identified a blocked artery that needed immediate attention, and after doing the emergency procedure, the doctor advised him on a newer, healthier lifestyle. No smoking, less fried food, and plenty of exercise. So basically, the government could lead in setting the direction and setting up the framework, and then it's the private sector. The body has to recover itself. The natural constitution has to strengthen its immunity system and move on. Having said that, I now want to share with you three questions before this. Three questions. First, does the Malaysian economy need to go to a medical clinic? Is it sick? And the second thing is, if it is sick, what is making it sick? And three, I don't know how I know I move fast, but clearly, like DAP, they cannot count, right? They counted the votes wrong. I can count, sorry. So in that sense, the DAP must not be a Chinese party. You cannot count. So 1, 2, 3, not 1, 3, 5, sorry. The last question is, what is the international experience in curing the type of economic sickness that Malaysia is suffering from? Now let us see if Malaysia has been sick. Let us compare ourselves with Korea, Taiwan, and see how they have done. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. What happened is, at the formation of Malaysia in 1963, Taiwan was 12.6% of US income level. Korea was 10.7% of US income level. Malaysia was richer than the other two at 13.6%. Before the Asian financial crisis, Taiwan had jumped to 55% of US level, South Korea to almost 50%, and Malaysia at 30%. We have grown slower, but we have moved. So we may be the tortoise that might beat the hare. The only trouble is, in the last 10 years, you could see that the other two countries has closed the gap in the US by 11 percentage points. And we have closed the gap by 1 percentage point. This is what we mean by a middle income trap. Our economy may be growing, but it is not growing fast enough to catch up with the developed countries in the world. And catching up is not a matter of just being materially prosperous, but it's a matter of being able to afford first world medicine for your parents and to afford a first-class education for your children. To have first world medicine, first-class education, you need to have a first world income. So this shows you that the Malaysian disease is economic stagnation. And that has been true since 1995. Basically, we have been stuck for the last 15 years. Now, clearly, the government does not believe the good news in our good news papers. Because look at what the government's response has been. Next slide. The government has been coming up with a series of comprehensive programs, one after another. And let me talk about the four that we really know. We have the talent core, we have the regional development programs, you have the economic transformation program, the government transformation program. The existence of all of these programs denotes at least the following. The next slide, please. Is that the talent core shows that there's great shortage of human talent, and so that's why we're not moving up the value-added chain. That's why we're stuck where we're stuck. The Northern Corridor is because the rest of the country is unnaturally underdeveloped compared with the Klang Valley because of the shortage of infrastructure all around. And the economic transformation plan is because the reason why we have grown slower from 9% before 1996 to 5% from 2000 onwards is because investment rate has fallen by almost half. Because investment rate has fallen, GDP growth rate has slowed. So that's why Najib's big emphasis is on kicking up the investment. Then, since that is not succeeding, he thinks that the government is not doing a good enough job, so he has a government transformation program. These programs have not worked and will not work because they have been producing outcome one of the analogy I talked about. In outcome one, the doctor focused on the symptom, the general fatigue, and he prescribed something that fixed the symptom. But however, without fixing the underlying cause, you are doomed to, you won't have an acceptable long-run situation. So what are the root causes? The root causes that I want to talk about are four. Oops. Back. Yeah, thank you. The four root causes are: number one, I think we have socio-economic policies that have encouraged brain drain in Malaysia. So why ask for people to come back when you do not remove the causes that make them left in the first place? The second is we have a tax on the growth of firms. This 30% and now 12.5% on mandated sales of equity to people selected by the government is causing capital flight. Malaysia in 2010, it has the second largest capital flight in the world. First was China at 600 billion, Malaysia at around 56 billion, and Mexico around 43 billion. But look at it in per person terms of each country. In the case of China, that translated to $300 per person that's run out. Mexico, $400 per person that's run out. In the case of Malaysia, it's $2,275 per person that has run out. Malaysia boleh lari for sure. So that's capital flight. And then the over-centralization of economic policies. That has to do with, like for example, the Penang state government wants to invest in infrastructure that will enable local growth, but it cannot borrow money without permission from Putrajaya. And furthermore, even the Penang state government has the money, has raised the money by some other means, it cannot do it unless it's permission from Putrajaya on a whole range of things. And the result is, this over-centralization has suppressed developmental efforts at the local level. And that's why we have this great shortage of infrastructure and hence existence of production bottlenecks outside of the Klang Valley. The fourth one is the lack of transparency in government operations. The best one you can think of is negotiated tenders instead of open tenders. So, and with this lack of transparency, there cannot be accountability. With no accountability, performance deteriorates. So, this is not to, these policies that have been said, next slide, are like Dr. Siri Anwar just said, these policies are outdated. The policies that were implemented were the products of past times. Specifically, a lot of the numerical targets was to quickly raise the number. But after we have achieved the numbers, we still stick to the quota system. I think that it's time for new instruments to be used to address imbalances. And the over-centralization of power began with the way Malaysia was founded, the emergency in 1957. And when we confronted Indonesia in 1963, we cancelled council elections because we did not want to dissipate our energy with local elections. But Chin Peng and Sukarno have long disappeared, but the local elections have yet to reappear. And basically, the non-transparency in government operations, you could say in the past, the city councillors were too badly educated outside of the large cities. So you cannot explain these things to them, they won't understand. But this is no longer the situation today. So having said all of that, let me ask, what have the international experiences suggest to us? The next slide, please. Malaysia faces a fork in the road. Either we adopt experiences or policies that have been proven elsewhere to address the kind of problems we have, or we do what we are doing. We just introduce a new set of policies to offset the illness of the old policies. For example, when we find that the ministries are not cooperating, we set up the implementation coordination unit. Then the implementation coordination unit fails to improve performance, so we set up MAMPU. And then MAMPU didn't improve things, so we set up the economic Pemandu now. So basically, if one thing doesn't work, there you are hitting your head with your hand, and you're trying to put a piece of paper to stop yourself from hitting yourself on the head. Lots of what is happening is self-inflicted. And now what I want to do is to look at international experience and then draw 3 principles. The first thing I want to look at is that we have seen big changes at the end of the 20th century and in the beginning. And what are some of these big changes? We all know the collapse, the implosion of the Soviet Empire. And in East Asia, closer to home, we had the defeat of the Grand National Party in Korea in '97 after holding power there since 1961. This is Park Chung-hee's legacy. And then in '98, Suharto resigned after being in power since '65. In the year 2000, the Kuomintang was defeated, Chen Shui-bian was elected, and ending the rule of the KMT since 1945. In 2000 also saw the defeat of the Institutional Revolutionary Party of Mexico, which has held power since 1929. So history has made a big turn, but history is full of irony. Why? Let's go to the next slide. Today, the GNP under Ms. Park, KMT under Ma Ying-jeou, the PRI are all now back in power in these countries. They are back in power, but with 2 differences. They have not restored their previous policies. Specifically, they are no longer implementing the crony capitalism that they were holding up. In Korea, the chaebol groups are no longer dictating economic policies the ways they used to do before. More importantly, in all 3 cases, these parties are committed to continuing and broadening the policies of their immediate predecessors. Basically, their predecessor took the turn in the road, and they are now pushing along the turn in the road. The important thing is because the GNP, the KMT, and the PRI that are in existence today are not the same people who were voted out. There was a generational change in those parties. There was a reformulation of the policies of all these parties, and they reformulated themselves to become more like the people who defeated them than to return to some golden past of the past. So the first thing is, to make a turning point, you need new people. That's general principle number 1. The next slide, please. So the important thing is, when are people likely to make changes? They are likely to make changes when they are not beholden to the previous office holder. For example, why did Mikhail Gorbachev not do what Boris Yeltsin did? Reform is a highly dangerous thing in that it is politically delegitimizing potentially. In other words, if today I do the following, and next week I turn 180 degrees around and do the opposite, it is a confession of I've been screwing up in the past few years in what I'm doing. But if I have been screwing up, then why am I still in charge? So making changes is very difficult for an incumbent because it's an admission you have screwed up. And the further you are away that you can detach yourself from the past, not beholden to it, the more likely you are to make changes. That is why Boris Yeltsin is able to have large-scale changes rather than rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic. He reversed the course of the ship rather than changing it, changing the surface phenomena. Look at the successor to Mao, Hua Guofeng, who was appointed with the words by Mao that with you in charge, I am at ease. 有你办事我放心. And what happened? Deng Xiaoping deposed him. And because it was Deng Xiaoping who was not appointed by Mao, he had the legitimacy to turn against the policies of Mao and introduce economic reform. Basically, he could turn against the traditional communist practices and embrace new policy initiatives. But look at what is it that has changed the difference between, if you were to compare Yeltsin and Deng. Yeltsin is often criticizing for doing things too quickly. That's why the Soviet Union did not perform well. Whereas Deng Xiaoping did the patient-oriental way of gentle massage, and hence the Chinese economy has been growing well. I would answer that question later, but more importantly, realize that it is easier for Putin to be completely different from Gorbachev because Putin was no longer a member of the Communist Party. The whole team of people in the past had been wiped out. Deng Xiaoping was in a different faction of the same party. He was the party secretary in the 1950s when 30 million Chinese starved to death in the Great Leap Forward. So he is a product of the past, partially. So that's why he could not swing around very quickly, because it would be confession that he had been totally confused all those years too. More importantly, a lot of the people in his factions were people of his age. They still believe in communism, so he's unable to change their mind. So what he does is he has to act slowly. Do you know why? Because if you look at why China's economic reforms has been speeding up over time, it's because progress comes funeral by funeral. The old man dies, they're not around to object, and the young people could do what needed to be done. The phrase is not original with me. That is the observation of the greatest economic theorist of the 20th century, Paul Samuelson. He said progress comes to economic theory funeral by funeral. So similarly, in the case of China, the old man dies, so economic reform progresses. So principle number one is, if you need to do drastically new things, for example, clearing the blocked artery, is more likely to be done by someone who is not emotionally attached to the past. Like, for example, a doctor should not operate on his own parents because you're too emotionally attached to the patient and you cannot do a good job. So let's move to the second lesson that I'll talk about. Here, in the reform of the Eastern European economies, one of the big questions you hear is fast reform versus slow reforms. If you do big bang reforms, which means fast comprehensive reforms, it will shake the whole structure and the whole thing will come down. Whereas you need to do gradual incremental reforms. It's one person gave the example is, how do you wake up somebody? You can grab him by the shoulder and shake him awake, but then you snap his neck back and he's dead. Whereas the other way, you kind of slowly pat his face, tickle his nose, and then he wakes up and is well. That's the wrong analogy. That's the wrong analogy. Because what you should do fast or do slow depends on the particular problem that you are addressing. If it is price deregulation, imagine that the prices of everything is controlled in a particular economy. Now you want to marketize the economy, you want to free prices. Think of the following slow sequence. You say, this week I free the price of soap, next week I free the price of perfume, the third week I free the price of toilet paper. Versus, if you were to do these things slowly, one at a time, what would happen? Chaos. Because people know that when this week comes, the price of soap is deregulated, next week is perfume. So what happened? Everybody wants to buy it now, and the people selling it will hide it until then. The plan stinks because there's no soap, no perfume, and no toilet paper in the meanwhile. So there are certain things when you got to do quickly. You let go all the prices at once. Whereas things like privatization, you got to do slowly, because otherwise it's hard, very unfair. How do you privatize something overnight? The only way you can privatize something overnight is you give it to the managers. Let him steal it. That is clearly unacceptable and inefficient. So that is a slow process. So fast or slow depends on what you're talking about. And the whole problem with being slow, if you have a deliberate policy, is that you can be easily stopped by vested interest. There are always more feasibility studies to be done. Now, how do you escape that trap? Here we come to general principle number 3, is that the important thing to know is that what you are facing is nothing new most of the time. The rest of the world has faced similar situations. For example, collapse of the banking system, soaring inflation, government inefficiency, all of these have been seen before. And what you need to do is to really look at best international practices and adopt it and adapt according to local circumstances. Adopt and adapt is the key. There's this whole debate that is in the literature. You should always look what is up. You should always discover the policies that are uniquely optimal for you and not just learn blindly from elsewhere. This is a confusion between what I call innovation in the global sense, i.e. something that's truly new, versus taking the broad direction and adjusting the speed and the mechanisms according to your own circumstances. That's what I call innovation in the local sense. Like, for example, changing from central planning to a market economy, that is innovation in the global sense. The whole system change. How you privatize different mechanisms, that you do according to your own circumstances, and that is innovation in the local sense. I think that the important thing is as economics is concerned, the guiding principle to avoid going too slow, is that you should always be aware that you are converging to something that is proven to work, rather than trying to rediscover the wheel of what works. We have a rich history and a guide of where to sit. And what we have learned is that countries that have identified its direction correctly and moved decisively to implement those measures, they recover the fastest. Like all of Eastern Europe collapsed, and the ones that recover fastest were the ones that acted most boldly and most quickly. I want to end my talk with a digression by explaining why this debate about shock therapy and gradual reform is misguided. If you look at all the countries that reform slowly, China grew, but Ukraine, which reformed even slower, collapsed. Romania, which reformed slowly, collapsed. Bulgaria collapsed. And let us look at so among the people who reform slowly, you see people who grow, China, and a whole bunch of collapse. Then you look at the countries that reform quickly, Russia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, output all collapse. But Vietnam and Laos in 1989 implemented overnight drastic reforms, and their growth rate jumped by 5 percentage points and remained high until the Asian financial crisis. The important thing of why you have the difference in collapse versus output has nothing to do with speed. It has everything to do with the initial conditions in this country. China, Vietnam, Laos, they all grew regardless of whether you farm slowly or quickly because they were overwhelmingly agricultural countries. So when marketization came, industrialization occurred. People moved up from agriculture to the industries, so growth was released. Whereas in the Eastern European countries, they are already industrialized, already urbanized. The agricultural sector is like 10% of the economy. Most of the people are either in heavy industries or in light industries. And there were too many in heavy industries. And the only way the light industries could grow is heavy industries got to collapse to release people for the light industries. In the case of China, there was no heavy industry to collapse because it hardly exists. The light industry could grow because people came out from the countryside and grew. So, given the particular conditions in Malaysia, we are confident that there would not be a collapse if there's a change in government because our initial conditions does not require such a total reorientation of the economy. We need a stent put in. We do not need a heart transplant. So that is the big difference. So now what I would like to do is to tell you that we have put all of these 3 principles into formulating something we designed for the state of Penang, which we think is applicable for the rest of Malaysia. I hope you can get online and give us comments on the plan we have for Penang. Thank you.
You do have that chance of tripping in reform, but that shouldn't stop us from moving forward. Now, Prof. Wu has given us a very thought-provoking talk, reminding us that we should not be focusing on preserving short-term stability. Because what's the point of remaining, in your comfort zone only to be heading towards doomsday? Instead, what he has been talking about is very much about destruction, constructive destruction. How do you break the old to bring in the new? Right? Now, how is this relevant to us? Malaysians are very cautious. We always look for example and so then say, let other people try it first. That's how we miss all the chances of regime change. If you remember, in 1990, we're supposed to be our time because that was the height of the third wave of democratization, but we give it a miss. Then we come to 1999, with the East Asian crisis and so on. Again, we miss it. In 2008, we were so close, we missed it again. So we finally come here. And many people are still thinking and say, well, would it be good, would it be bad, would it be good, would it be bad? Now perhaps, there's no better way of looking at that answer from people who have actually gone through that. Malaysians like to look at Indonesia and say, well, they are the bigger brother, but they're the poorer one. We like to think in a way as if like we are much more better. Indonesians, we always associate them with maids or construction workers and so on. But no, that's no longer the case. Indonesia is no longer sending maids to Malaysia at our terms. And the friends were talking about that, how many years down the road, if we are not reforming, that we may be sending maids to Surabaya, Jakarta, and so on. For all you know, that we can provide maids that speak Malay and English to the rich man in Indonesia, and maybe to speak English and Chinese for the rich people in Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen. That's the kind of situation we are in.